Welcome back. I'm Ali Velshi. Breaking news at this hour. According to an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll out just moments ago, 80% of registered voters say they feel that things are generally out of control in the United States, while nearly 60% of all voters say they are more troubled by George Floyd's death and the actions of the Minneapolis police than they are by the protests that followed it. This as those protests honoring the memory of George Floyd continue across our country. The 46-year-old will be honored at a memorial in Houston tomorrow. He'll be buried there on Tuesday. Most of the protests from coast to coast remain peaceful. Things got a little tense in Seattle as police used flashbangs, a familiar but never popular tactic among protesters to disperse the crowd there. In San Francisco, large crowds making a statement and holding up traffic at the Golden Gate Bridge by taking a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's the length of time Derek Chauvin held his knee on George Floyd's neck. In our nation's capital, large crowds gathered outside the White House all day and into the night, despite President Trump's tweets to the contrary. And this morning, the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, writing an op-ed in the LA Times saying we need to implement real community policing and ensure that every police department in the country undertakes a comprehensive review of its hiring, their training, and their de-escalation practices, with the federal government providing the tools and resources needed to implement reforms. In New York, multiple officers have been charged for their roles in the violence during the protests. Governor Andrew Cuomo looking to take the lead on criminal justice reform with a moniker that's familiar to protesters.
We have the Say Their Name agenda, transparency of prior disciplinary actions for police officers, the 50A bill, no chokeholds. No chokeholds. How many times do you have to learn the same lesson? No false race-based 9/11 reports. The Attorney General is an independent prosecutor for police murders. Pass the bills. Actually make the change. Then other states will look at New York and say, well, New York did this, why can't we do it?
Joining me now, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with New York Times Magazine, and Trymaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the fantastic Into America podcast. Thanks to both of you for being here. Nicole, I just want to start because we've got a poll that indicates stuff that we know. Americans think this is out of control. They should, because it is. But we also have polls that have indicated that most Americans believe that African Americans are treated unfairly by the police. And there's a growing movement of people who think we either need to redirect police resources or defund the police or give the police adequate training to do their jobs. Is what Joe Biden just said going to be enough resources, federal resources, to help police do what they're supposed to do better?
No, I don't think that's going to be enough. I don't think that's what Americans are calling for. We should take a second and just pause on how astounding these polling numbers are. Never in modern American history have we seen such large numbers of Americans acknowledging that racism amongst policing is widespread, but also in general society. That poll was also about that Black Americans face pervasive racism in society at large, with 76% of Americans saying that and 71% of white Americans. We've never seen that before. So I don't think simply calls for more funding for police departments as if the problem with the way that police Black people is about funding. It's not about funding. It's about accountability. It's about treating communities with humanity. And more funding is not going to accomplish that.
Trymaine Lee, you tweeted the other day, Black Americans are exhausted. They're grieving. They're angry. They've grown tired of being forced to make the case for their citizenship, their humanity, their very survival again and again over the course of generations. What's changed this time, Trymaine? Because they were angry in the 60s. They were angry throughout the civil rights movement. What's different today?
I think what's different is kind of what's been the same. When you think about Dr. King and his nonviolent approach to social change, it wasn't that he was necessarily nonviolent. He wanted to show the world, allow the world to see the violence heaped upon Black folks. And I think this time, with the senseless, inexplicable death of George Floyd, I think America, white America in particular, got a taste of what happens in cities all across America every single day. And then as we have this kind of cross-racial, cross-cultural mass movement, white folks on the front lines being beaten by police. We've seen the videos now, right, of the baton-wielding police even beating white protesters, spraying them with pepper spray in the eye. I think they're getting a taste of it. But also, I think there is this sense of America being out of control, out of order. You think about COVID-19, the stress and tension. Now, folks are just bound up, and there's so much uncertainty. And I think this time, even though we are at a pivot point and there is hope for great change, the pendulum always swings back. Right, the monster of anti-blackness, which is, again, hardwired into who we are as Americans, will rear its head. Those who always push back against progress, as they always have, from Reconstruction, then you have redemption. You call for desegregation, then you have white flight and white folks just abandoning cities, abandoning schools. And so while we are at this moment, once we get back to quote unquote normal, when folks get back to their jobs and can go on vacation and eat at their restaurants, we'll see how much people really, really want change.
Nicole, you have written an article, a piece for which you won a Pulitzer Prize, talking about how Americans didn't enjoy democracy without African Americans. It sort of feels that way now, right? We're not free. And I think Americans are starting to realize, Americans who are not black are starting to understand that if you are the beneficiary of treatment from police that is different from people who are of color or black, then it's not fair. We're all in chains if one of us is in chains.
Yes, absolutely. I've been thinking so much about as we saw, this all started with black people taking to the streets and demanding to be treated like citizenship. And the beautiful thing is people of all races have joined in that struggle. But this has always been the case in this country, is that democracy has been very thinly held. It has not included all Americans. And it has been black protest that has pushed us further to democracy. And it has been black people leading this struggle now. I agree with Tremaine. And this was a tactic of the civil rights movement. Black people being out there marching alone never seemed to bring the type of outrage as when white people got involved and white people started getting abused by the police and abused by those who oppose civil rights. And we're seeing that same thing. And it's sad but true, but often only through the eyes of seeing an old white man who could be your grandfather getting pushed down by the police and left to bleed. Were white people able to feel an empathy for the experience that black Americans have all of the time? So what we're seeing, the way the press is being treated right now, the way protest is being repressed right now, these are experiences that have always been in this country and that black people have had to push against. And they're being exposed to white Americans who have been able to ignore this.
I'm looking at pictures while you're on the screen of another massive protest in London. We saw one yesterday at this time. We're seeing another one underway right now. I mean, Tremaine, here's the sad part. Those two cops in Buffalo who pushed that 75-year-old white man down, left him on the sidewalk bleeding, were charged. And 57 of their teammates on the Buffalo emergency response team quit. They didn't really quit, by the way. They just quit the team. They're still getting paid as police. And then they applauded them at court. I mean, this is the problem, Tremaine, that police are meeting the criticism of police with exactly the stuff that people were criticizing about police.
You know, we always hear this idea of just a few bad apples, and it seems like there are a few baskets full of bad apples. And it always is astounding and amazing to me that peaceful protests or unarmed protesters arrive to protest police violence, and they're met with more police violence. You know, rubber bullets aren't just non-fatal, they're less fatal. They can still hurt and maim. And you've been out there doing great work, and you've been on the receiving end of some of this tear gas and the rubber bullets. So it is amazing, but this is the systemic nature of what we're talking about here, right? It's not just an individual. There are individuals supported by an entire system. And we see it playing out, 57 stepping down after what was really a horrific video of that old man being pushed to the ground, bleeding from his head. But this is where we are, and this is why change has been so stubborn.
Nicole, do you think that something will come of this. The New York City Mayor de Blasio has just announced this morning he's lifting the curfew in New York. There will not be another curfew. Do you think some change comes of this? Because the change that we're looking at, and President Obama spoke about this last week, it's county executives, it's mayors, it's police chiefs. It's not actually going to be easy for the federal government to implement this. Will we see change, or does this die down until we get the next video of a person dying while saying they can't breathe?
So as a journalist, I try to never make predictions because I try to never look foolish. And I think when you do that, you end up ultimately being wrong. But what I will say is if this pressure remains, if people don't just go home and give up, the chances for change are quite large. Governor Cuomo in New York just announced the Say Their Names Act today, which is trying to really implement some measures against or for police accountability, and he's calling on other governors and other jurisdictions to do the same thing. We would not have that without these massive and ongoing and sustained protests. I think it's also important to say this is a pivotal moment. When we saw in the 1960s uprisings all across the country, white support for civil rights actually declined. We're seeing the opposite effect here, and that is really offers a potential for something transformative. Not just policing, though. The economic circumstances of Black Americans is horrifying. And we need to also be talking about economic justice. And so what I would hope is that we're going to see calls for both economic justice for Black Americans as well as policing reform.
Thanks to both of you for the great work that you continue to do to educate the public on some of the things that we were not taught in school and we do not talk about in society. Nikole Hannah-Jones, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the New York Times Magazine, and MSNBC correspondent Tremaine Lee.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.